All right, so this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 10, Jacksonian Democracy, 1820 to 1840. We'll be looking at Section 1, a new political style from John Quincy Adams to Andrew Jackson. So this chapter, Jacksonian Democracy, is largely focused on some of the politics of the era. Last chapter, chapter 9, we talked more about how the economy changed, how society changed, especially in the North. Here we're getting back to the politics, and it really surrounds the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And, I would say probably from about, maybe, Thomas Jefferson being the third president, James Madison being the fourth president, between presidents 4 and 16, there really aren't a lot of too many important U.S. presidents between that, 16 being presidency of Abraham Lincoln. But probably the most important person along the way to serve in the White House was Jackson. So this chapter kind of focuses on why his presidency was important. So getting back to the political changes, one thing that we should recall is the decline of the Federalist Party. That the first party system, the political party system that really characterized the early United States, recall that this was, on the one hand, the Federalists, and they stood opposed to the Republicans, sometimes called the Democratic Republicans, to differentiate them from the modern Republican Party. It was different. And in the Federalist camp was Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams. On the Republican side, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. And, these two political parties were very competitive and rather combative in the early era. But the Federalist Party finds its downfall. And recall that the downfall was caused by the opposition to the War of 1812. At the Hartford Convention. The War of 1812, we said, there isn't really too much in terms of consequences from the War of 1812, but the two things that we certainly want to remember why it's important was, one, it led to the downfall of the Federalist Party. Recall that during the French Revolution, the Federalists tended to favor the British side. Well, in the War of 1812, the United States was fighting the British, so it's never a good look to support the side that your country's at war against. They were essentially labeled as traitors and really never recovered. In fact, the 1816 election was kind of the final nail in the tomb. We just might say that the Federalists lost and never gained the presidency. In fact, they weren't even competitive really in the 1816 election. They would, John Adams would be the last Federalist president in American history. So the Federalist was one of the downfalls. The other important consequence from the War of 1812 kind of gets back to this whole chapter, and that was the new generation of leadership, specifically war heroes like Andrew Jackson, but other people like, the war hawks, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, William Henry Harrison, another war hero. So in terms of why the War of 1812 is important, two things: death of the Federalist Party and the rise of really a new generation of American leadership. So what was changing here was the political system, not just in terms of changes to the first party system. The first party system is, effectively gone with the War of 1812. The only political party that's competitive is the Republican Party, or the Democratic Republican Party. But so too was the culture of politics. Really in the early years, especially for the first 5 presidencies, there was a certain code of deference. Deference just really kind of means sort of respect. around the leadership, especially as it pertained to the American Revolution and shortly afterwards. And this was the idea of treating American politicians almost like an aristocracy. So that would be like an elite or nobility. Now, the United States didn't have a nobility. There were no, bloodlines that went back hundreds of years in the United States. It was a brand new nation. But those revolutionary leaders, like George Washington especially, were pretty much treated like they were nobility or like they were elites. A perfect example was the story that was told about George Washington later on after his death, and that was, the story of him being a child and chopping down a cherry tree. When confronted, he famously said, I can not tell a lie, right? So, it's this idea that these figures like Washington are almost larger than life. They're not quite on the same level as kind of all the other politicians. They have a certain respect that people give them, more so than anybody else, right? They're almost like an elite or noble class, an aristocracy. That changes, and the change that takes place is that politics becomes much more democratic. More people participate in it. And really, if we were to kind of summarize what Jacksonian democracy is, it's pretty much this point right here. And that contains some of the democratic reforms that took place. In short, it's the removal of property qualifications when it comes to voting and implementing universal manhood suffrage. We might also want to add just sort of a what do you call it? A sort of quick edit here. Universal white manhood suffrage is really what it meant at the time. So the major change taking place is that property qualifications are being moved. So we might just say property qualifications, we'll say, are being removed. And this is we'll just call it the most important change in the era. And the way that it worked was there was a culture of democracy that was flourishing in the United States, those sorts of ideas. Also recall that, the French Revolution had taken place since, and that sort of injected maybe another, injected sort of more energy into this debate about democracy and what it means to be a citizen and to have a government by the people, for the people. But in the United States, it really started with some of the new states. As new states began to get added to the United States, they did not require any property requirement. So we might say new states did not require property to vote. And so that had the effect of drawing people to the new states, and it ultimately forced old states, right? We're talking about the 13 original ones, to change, which they eventually did. So, of those old voter qualifications that we talked about in the last section, that, or in one of the previous sections, we labeled them 1, 2, 3, that in order to vote in the United States, at the very beginning, you had to be male, you had to be white, and you had to have some sort of financial requirement, mostly owning property, sometimes paying taxes. The big change that takes place during the 1820s is that this criteria is getting eliminated, right? That property requirement. And that is to say, and that is to, remind us or keep us reminded that voting was, it's called the age of democracy. But in terms of having full participation, it wasn't, it wasn't fully democratic. That women were prohibited from voting. That women could not vote. And even in the North, that blacks or African Americans had restricted voting rights. So I think, for example, your textbook mentions that in some states, blacks or African Americans were totally prohibited from voting. In some states, they weren't. In other states, there were additional requirements. So, for example, whites might have universal suffrage, but blacks or African Americans might still have to own property or might still have to pay some sort of tax or some sort of fee. So, democratic in a sense of, again, keeping these voting qualifications in mind. It's the elimination of property requirements. And again, this creates a new political system, one in which party politics are geared, and this is kind of what changes, towards the masses and not elites. Elites were still important, but now there's a whole new base of voters that, number one, need to be told that, by the way, you can vote now. And then number two, this is the political party that you should vote for. And so political parties like the Bucktails, a Bucktail party was I believe a New York political party. We'll say that pioneered, so they were one of the first, appeal to the masses. Right, so they're kind of one of the first political parties, again, local in New York. It was headed by Martin Van Buren. Van Buren is often credited as the person who kind of really was working behind the scenes, doing the heavy lifting when it came to go out and getting votes and creating a modern political system. And in New York, the Bucktails were effective in getting more direct elections to, we'll say, to staff the bureaucracy, or just the government. The government's a better word. So whereas before, positions might have been appointed by, state legislatures or whatever it was, more and more across places like New York, across states, really throughout the United States, more and more people were voting for political offices, political positions, sheriff, mayor, whatever, right? Whatever it may be. But also with this political system came a new emphasis on loyalty to the party. The spoils system is a term used to describe any sort of political favors handed out based on loyalty. So we might say of the spoils system, it is to, we'll say, hand out government power based on loyalty, right? And loyalty is kind of the key word. So people who were loyal to the party got rewarded, and that might mean receiving a very comfortable government job with a high salary. Maybe they weren't the best person for the job, but that didn't matter. What mattered is that they were loyal. You can kind of compare and contrast this to the way that George Washington staffed the government, right? Washington appointed cabinet members based off of their ability, right? He chose Thomas Jefferson to be part of his cabinet, even though Thomas Jefferson was a part of the other political party. This is kind of the reverse. Okay, it's saying, okay, we're going to appoint only people who are loyal, and forget qualifications, essentially. And that was the way that really Jackson's party and really politics for the next 80 years was done in the United States. So all of these changes, right, especially again this change up here, played a part locally first, state by state, with groups like the Bucktails, but eventually made their way to the federal election. The election of 1824 really was a turning point, and it was, for the first time, you saw the effect of having a whole new class of people enfranchised like they had never been enfranchised before. It was a 5-way race. It ultimately ended up being only a 4-way race. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who you see pictured right here, he eventually dropped out. But and William Crawford, he was never really a significant threat. But the election itself really came down to 3 people. John Quincy Adams of the North, specifically the Northeast. He was the son of John Adams, right? And really the kind of definition of elite, right? He was educated. He had been to Europe. He's literally the son of a founding father, a president. He is about as elite as you can get. Then you have Henry Clay, who is really a champion of the West. He also champions things like the American system, internal improvements. He was a candidate here. Henry Clay ultimately becomes known as sort of a great compromiser, getting people to get along with each other, politicians especially when they don't want to. And then there was Andrew Jackson, who in a lot of ways represented the South, he represented the West, but he was also the war hero. And Andrew Jackson here, he was the people's president, right? This was the guy that the masses wanted to vote for, not the elites. In fact, in some of the campaigns, some of the slogans were vote for Jackson who could fight, not for Adams who can write. In other words, the people wanted a fighter, not not a writer, not a brainiac, not a member of the elite classes. And in that election, because of the changes that had taken place on a local and state level, both the popular and electoral vote was won by Jackson. However, Andrew Jackson did not win a majority of the electoral votes. When that happens, the election then goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, Clay, Adams, and Jackson, right, were pretty much the only ones that were taken seriously in terms of who could potentially win it. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams combined their votes together, because even though Henry Clay was essentially conceding the election, the last thing that Clay wanted was the president of the people to win. And so this agreement between Clay and Adams to combine their votes and cheat Andrew Jackson out of the presidency was known as the corrupt bargain. So the corrupt bargain was the deal between Clay and Adams to combine votes, and the votes would be in favor of Adams. Adams would be the one who would be voted president. Adams then would appoint Henry Clay, I think as Secretary of State, I want to say, some high-ranking position within the Adams administration, but deal between Clay and Adams to combine votes to force Jackson to lose. And this really got the supporters of Andrew Jackson himself, pretty enraged, right? And his supporters definitely mobilized around him, allowing Andrew Jackson to run for president just 4 years later and completely changing the political system. Now, the presidency of John Quincy Adams wasn't really all that successful. A lot of Jackson supporters cried foul. They said that he cheated, that he wasn't the real president and therefore would not pass much of his legislation. But things that John Quincy Adams supported included the American system. And again, this was something that was supported by Henry Clay. It was a term that we defined in a couple chapters ago, or I think maybe even last chapter. It's an umbrella in term that really just means any sort of internal improvement to the country, or maybe investment. So think of the National Bank, road systems, investing in canals, railroads. This all falls under the American system. So too does tariffs or protective tariffs. And so John Quincy Adams and Congress continued to pass tariffs as they were passed before. However, more and more opposition to tariffs became more vocal, I would say, so much so that some refer to these tariffs as the tariff of abominations. And the split here is really between the North and the South. And again, recall that in the North, that's where all the manufacturing is taking place, right? That's where all the factories are being built. In the South doesn't have any factories. And so these tariffs, which in short do protect American businesses, they're really only benefiting the North. And so it's really the South that comes to oppose the tariffs. We might say oppose tariffs. Because all it means for the South is that now they have to buy more expensive domestic made quality than, rather than being able to buy foreign goods at a much cheaper price. In fact, the person who is the most vocal against this tariff of abominations, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. So, yes, again, the idea is that tariffs do protect American businesses, but they don't affect all Americans equally. If all the businesses are located in the North, then the tariffs tend to favor the North and actually hurt or harm the South.